Mark Ryan had this tweet yesterday. Spoke to an NFL source over lunch who told me Carolina, the Panthers, is far more zeroed in on C.J. Stroud and Anthony Richardson than Bryce Young. Almost to the point you wonder if Bryce Young is still being considered. A direct quote. Your commentary afterwards in said tweet, imagine trading a boatload for a project at number one, which we would both agree Anthony Richardson is, given how much we've watched Anthony Richardson over the course of this last calendar year. Maybe C.J. Stroud's a little bit less of one. Set the scene for us here. Is this something that you expected to hear when you had this conversation about the state of the Panthers?
I'm frankly shocked, Paul. And it's like, tell me you don't know what you're doing without telling me you don't know what you're doing. They give up a historical amount to move up to number one, and then don't seem to have a plan for what they want to do with number one. There were reports that Dave Tepper liked Bryce Young. Frank Reich only likes bigger quarterbacks. Frank Reich seems to be winning that power struggle right now. There are reports they could trade down again. That would seem to imply they're in love with Anthony Richardson, because you wouldn't trade down if you're going after Bryce Young or C.J. Stroud, given where they're projected to go. And, Paul, to localize this for your audience, and I know you and I might put up our dukes over this, is that Houston could have avoided all of this drama and all of this mess simply by not converting a Hail Mary. Now, I think part of your anti-tanking strategy, Paul, is well-founded, but as a wise man once told me, there are levels to this. You don't blow the number one pick on the final game of the season. Imagine how stress-free it would be for Houston fans if they just had their pick of the litter and they weren't wondering, which one are we going to get? Which one is going to be left for us?
I get what you're saying, Mark, but I like to go through life with honor. And if honor gives me the second overall pick and not the worst record in the NFL over the last calendar year, then I will take it. Yes, it's stupid. So is Ned Stark. He had honor at the very least when he got decapitated in Game of Thrones. Spoiler alert. But I'm not going to lie, Mark, something you said right there. I feel less stressed about the Texans in that number 2 spot now that the Panthers have traded up, because something you just said right there, it sounds like the Panthers think they're in the middle of the movie Draft Day. So they're trading up to the number 1 spot, then they're going to trade back? That just reeks of an organization that is dysfunctional. And I'm really curious as to who's running the show. David Tepper strikes me as very impatient as an owner based off of what we know of him thus far. You would think that Frank Reich would have taken the job with Carolina because he would actually get the chance to finally pick a young quarterback as opposed to dealing with cars with 300,000 miles on them. What is your gauge on how much say Reich has if he wants those taller quarterbacks versus Tepper, who, like us, thinks that Bryce Young's probably the best quarterback in this year's draft?
Well, what I've been told, Paul, quite honestly, from people who work for the Carolina Panthers, is that under Jerry Richardson, who had his own faults, much discussed, is that it was a much more fun place to work when Richardson was there.
Jeans Friday.
There's a lot of folks over there that are looking for new employment, and it's been described to me that Dave Tepper is a bit of a tyrant. He meddles. He gets impatient. He pops off. There was an agreement to build corporate headquarters in Rock Hill, South Carolina, Paul. The project was half complete, at which point there was a financial dispute between Tepper and the city of Rock Hill, South Carolina, as to who was responsible for the rest. And now a half-built corporate headquarters just sits there, not being finished. And it is never going to be finished. And think of the millions wasted on that. This is what we're talking about here. And everyone in Charlotte is paralyzed to say anything about him because of fear of losing their jobs. But to your point, Paul, it reeks of a dysfunctional organization. And perhaps if some of that dysfunction has left Houston, they don't need to worry about this as much, because I think it's as safe a bet as any that Carolina is going to mess this up. And if Houston has their ducks in a row, they're going to get the best quarterback in the draft at number 2. There is really no telling at this point, but I had a good conversation yesterday, as we discussed, a very a trusted source. And I believe that Frank Reich is winning this power struggle to go with the bigger quarterbacks. And I think it's a mistake, as you just said. So that's where we are, Paul. I mean, it's a disaster of epic proportions. And, Paul, this is also the same franchise that once moved down from number 1 to number 5 in the draft and got only a second-round pick to show for it, right? They only got an extra second-round pick. 2 firsts, 2 seconds, and a 25-year-old Pro Bowl wide receiver, DJ Moore, in his prime. This is very Carolina, Paul.
Mark Ryan of ESPN Upstate in the Carolinas with us, and he tweeted yesterday, spoke to an NFL source over lunch who told me that Carolina is far more zeroed in on C.J. Stroud and Anthony Richardson than Bryce Young, which I think should make Texans fans, if they want Bryce Young, happy. I think most Texans fans would like Bryce Young. The quote, almost to the point you wonder if Bryce Young is still being considered. To go back to that conversation, this time of year you get a lot of smoke screens, and sometimes you see people in organizations feeding lines to media to perhaps create a narrative that changes the market. I don't know if those smoke screens actually work. Listening to you, I don't feel like that was the impression you got from this person you trust.
Not at all, Paul. Not at all. As a matter of fact, the impression that I got, and you know, Paul, it's like when you get a scoop, right? It's the same things go through your head that go through mine. This is where things stand today, and if things change, you know as well as I do, Paul. If the Carolina Panthers took Bryce Young, I'm going to get 5,000 "I told you so's" in my Twitter inbox. Well, that's to say that things can change. You understand that, I understand that. But where things are today is Frank Reich is winning that power struggle. He likes bigger quarterbacks, right? He went after Carson Wentz, went after Phillip Rivers, collecting the Social Security discount, and so he went after all of these people, all these older, flawed, corrupted to some degree, bigger quarterbacks, and I think he's winning that power struggle. Now, to be confused between C.J. Stroud and Anthony Richardson, how does that happen, Paul?
Yeah,
you have a
that's
very
weird.
polished prospect, and you have a prospect as raw as sushi. How do you get confused between those two? That's what I don't understand at all. C.J. Stroud is a prototypical pocket passer who is polished, who may have a more limited ceiling. Anthony Richardson's ceiling is totally undefined, but the 3 quarterbacks who threw for a lower completion percentage than he did and were drafted in the first round overall were Kyle Polar, Ryan Leaf, and Jake Locker. You know how that turned out.
Yes. We talked over the phone via text about Anthony Richardson. And Richardson was fun at Florida. There's no denying that. But fun with the first overall pick, that seems weird. And maybe that's, as you said a little bit earlier, why they're trying to get out of that pick so they can pick him a little bit later and feel less embarrassed about it. But, I mean, if they trade out of that spot, they're going to have to get a haul just to avoid embarrassment. Forget about the actual capital in return. If you were to put, based off of what you heard, a percentage of likelihood that a C.J. Stroud will be in Carolina or an Anthony Richardson will be in Carolina, what is that percentage split in your estimation right now?
I would say if I could get a 100-point wheel here, Paul.
Yes.
And this is funny. This is something I do on my show as well. I'd say 60% C.J. Stroud, 30% Anthony Richardson, 10% Bryce Young or other. Somebody talks sense into them at the last minute, and that's where I would put it today. I'd like to think there's some sense to take Stroud there if those are the two that you're in between. But if I could turn it around on you, Paul, and ask you a question, am I picking up the sense that Houston really wants Bryce Young?
So that has been tricky to figure out because Nick Caserio has turned the Texans into a version of the Kremlin. Stuff doesn't get out the way that it used to under previous regimes, even with Bill O'Brien, who I thought was very talkative with the media. I mean, Bill O'Brien would talk to me about stuff, for God's sake, from time to time. So I think where we're at right now, I feel it's difficult to say yes, but I feel like if you've got that number 2 overall pick, you just have to like one of these two quarterbacks at the top. And my impression is that they like they like two quarterbacks. I think they like Stroud too. I don't know that they're going to pull the trigger on Stroud, say he falls to 2, but I think if Bryce Young falls to 2, I would say, I'm going to say 80% that they would take him in that spot. The 20% is mainly because the Patriots used to do weird things. I feel like with Nick Caserio now here that the Texans could still do weird things.
No, I think that's well stated. And I also spoke to Russell Brown of Cover One yesterday, Paul, and I said to him, "Look, if Trevor Lawrence was a 10, what are these guys?" And he said Bryce Young is a 6.5, C.J. Stroud a 6, Anthony Richardson a 5.5, and Will Levis a 5, compared to Trevor Lawrence as a 10. So again, if you're looking at this year's draft class and you're saying, well, Bryce Young might be Jimmy Garoppolo, are you better waiting till next year when Caleb Williams and Drake May are going to be in there, and they could be 8.5 or 9s on the Trevor Lawrence scale of flowing hair beautifulness, right? I mean, like, who do you want? And is this year the guy? And I just continue to pick up the sense that Carolina shot their shot in a year without a slam dunk number one, in a year where the best guy might be Jimmy Garoppolo. What are you doing exactly?
It's a great question. It makes me feel better where the Texans are sitting at number 2. That is Mark Ryan from ESPN, Upstate CBS Sports Radio, at Mark Ryan on air. Mark, I appreciate the little nugget that you gave all of us when it comes to trying to figure out what the hell is going to happen in the draft. Thanks for your time, and have a good one, man.
Continued success, Paulie G. Great catching up with you, man. Hi to everybody in Houston.